A millionaire disguises himself as a doorman and is shocked by how she treated his autistic son. While specialists fail for years, a simple caregiver wins the boy over with affection and silence. He watches in secret, unable to explain why everything is changing before his eyes. But when he tries to reveal the truth, pride, lies, and prejudice nearly destroy the only chance for salvation. The news hit Richard Morgan like a blow that splits you in two. On the same day, his company closed the largest contract in Chicago's corporate history. Helen was lost during childbirth. All that remained was little Luke, a fragile baby now sleeping in an incubator at St. Monica's Hospital. Oblivious to the storm that had just swept through his existence before it had even begun, Richard watched the city from the panoramic window of his office on the top floor of the Horizon Tower in the city's financial district. At 38, he was at the helm of Morgan Development, one of the largest construction firms in the American Midwest. He was the kind of man the market admired, determined, calculating, a visionary. The kind of man who knew how to turn projects into fortunes. Morgan, the lawyers are on the line. The voice of Martha, his secretary, crackled through the intercom. Tell them I'm not available. But sir, it's about the estate, and double quotes. Not today, Martha. 3 years passed. The hallways of Richard's mansion in Kenilworth, an affluent Chicago suburb, remained silent. Grief had become a constant presence, like a shadow that followed him without announcing its arrival. In his room, Luke, now almost 4, lined up small cars in precise sequences. The diagnosis of severe autism came when the boy was 2.5. He needs routine, structure, and specialized support. Mr. Morgan, explained Dr. Morris, the most renowned pediatric
earlier we
neurologist
start therapy
in Illinois, the better the outcomes. Richard spared no expense. He transformed an entire wing of the mansion into a therapeutic center, complete with a sensory room, an adapted pool, and imported equipment. He hired a permanent team of specialists, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, a psychologist, a physical therapist. He set up a rotation of staff to ensure Luke was never without qualified supervision. You don't need to worry. We have everything under control, assured Rebecca, the team coordinator. Luke is receiving the best treatment money can buy. And it was true. Money bought the best. It bought state-of-the-art equipment, professionals with postdoctoral degrees, innovative methodologies. But there was something Richard noticed in rare moments of emotional clarity. Money couldn't buy genuine gazes. It couldn't buy true patience. It couldn't buy love. One Sunday afternoon, Richard decided to spend some time with his son. He rarely did. The company had expanded to New York and Los Angeles, and his days were consumed by meetings, travel, and negotiations. When he was home, he retreated to his office. Seeing Luke was like facing the mirror of his deepest failure. He couldn't protect Helen, and he couldn't connect with his own son. Luke was in the sensory room with Dr. Patricia Vance, the newest addition to the team, a behavioral specialist educated in the United States with methods considered revolutionary. Her hiring had cost Richard a penthouse apartment in Lincoln Park and an imported car. Richard stopped at the door, observing. Luke was trying to fit a piece into a puzzle but seemed frustrated. His movements became repetitive, his hands agitated. "No, Luke, not like that," said Dr. Vance, her voice firm. "Focus. Look at me when I speak." The boy remained focused on the puzzle, ignoring the command. I said, "Look at me." She held the boy's face, forcing eye contact. Luke immediately became dysregulated. He started clapping his hands over his ears, emitting a high-pitched sound, as if something were hurting him from within. "He needs to learn boundaries, Mr. Morgan," the specialist explained upon noticing Richard's presence. "It's through a structured methodology that we will achieve progress." Luke was now banging his head against the floor, his face showing pure terror. Dr. Vance tried to restrain him with physical control techniques, while explaining to Richard that this meltdown was part of the process. Something awoke inside Richard, a primitive instinct he thought was dormant. He entered the room, moved the specialist aside, and, not knowing exactly what to do, just sat on the floor next to his son. He didn't try to touch him. He didn't try to restrain him. He just stayed there, breathing deeply, waiting. Minutes that felt like hours passed until Luke, exhausted, lessened the intensity of his movements. His gaze, once lost, now fixed on a point on the wall. His breathing, still ragged, began to calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Morgan, you've just sabotaged weeks of work," said Dr. Vance, adjusting her lab coat. "We cannot give in during a behavioral crisis." Richard didn't answer. Something inside him had changed. For the first time, he saw himself as complicit. He realized that in his obsession to provide the best, he had strayed from the essential, being present. That night, after dismissing the night staff, Richard stayed in his son's room. Luke slept, finally peaceful. In the silence of those hours, Richard faced a painful truth. He didn't know his own son. He didn't know what calmed him, what scared him, what made him smile. He had outsourced not just the care, but fatherhood itself. The next morning, during a breakfast he rarely shared with Luke, Richard watched his son's precise movements as he organized his cereal by color before eating it. He saw beauty where he had previously only seen a problem to be managed. "Mr. Morgan, the helicopter is on the helipad to take you to New York," Martha informed him via his cell phone. "Cancel all my appointments for this week," Richard replied, without taking his eyes off his son. "But sir, the meeting with the Chinese investors, Gregory can handle it. Send all the documentation to him." Richard hung up the phone and continued watching Luke. An idea began to take shape in his mind. A radical, risky, possibly insane idea. But for the first time in years, he felt he was on the right path. In his office, after Luke was taken to his hydrotherapy session, Richard accessed the house's security system. He reviewed the recordings from the past few weeks. He watched how the professionals interacted with Luke when they thought no one was looking. Most were competent, yes. They followed protocols, yes. But there was something mechanical, distant, overly methodical in their gestures. No one really saw Luke. They saw a case, a diagnosis, a generous salary. Richard picked up the phone and called Arthur, his lawyer, an only friend since their college days. "I need you to prepare some documents, and to keep this between us." "What kind of documents?" "A new identity. A temporary one." "Richard, have you lost your mind?" "Maybe, but I have to do this. For Luke." As he explained his plan to Arthur, Richard already visualized the next steps. He would reduce his presence at the company, claiming a new confidential project. He would assume a simple identity without glamour or power. And then, he would do something he never imagined he would need to do. He would look for someone who could teach him how to be a real father. What Richard didn't know was that his search would not only lead him to discover new paths for Luke, but also to confront the walls he had built around his own heart, and that, in the process, he would find much more than he was looking for. 3 weeks later, the plan was in motion. Richard Morgan, the businessman known from the covers of Forbes, had transformed into Robert Miller, a simple man with cheap-framed glasses and slightly graying hair. An administrative employee newly hired by his own company, Morgan Developments, to work on the company's social projects. Arthur had created impeccable documentation, including a modest but respectable professional history. No one would question it. After all, who would look twice at a middle-aged man wearing unbranded cotton shirts and driving a 5-year-old silver Ford Focus? Richard rented a simple apartment in Lakeview, a middle-class Chicago neighborhood not far from his mansion. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a combined living room and kitchen, 1 bathroom. Basic furniture, bare walls. A place to sleep, nothing more. His real home remained the mansion in Kenilworth, where Luke remained under the care of the team. For now. "Are you sure about this?" Arthur asked, helping carry some boxes into the apartment. "This is insane, Richard. You could lose everything." "I'm losing my son a little more each day," he replied, adjusting the fake glasses that still bothered him. "This is the only path I can see right now." The next morning, Richard, now Robert, posted a discreet ad in a local newspaper and on an online platform. Seeking a caregiver for a child with special needs. Experience with autism is desirable. Must be available for exclusive dedication. A respectful, family-like environment. In-person interviews after a resume review. In the days that followed, Robert interviewed dozens of candidates in a commercial space rented specifically for this purpose. Many had impressive resumes, postgraduate degrees, specializations. They spoke of methodologies, therapeutic approaches, case studies, the same technical speeches he already knew. None of them sparked any sense of trust in him. On Wednesday, when he was starting to doubt his plan, that Irene Santos appeared. A woman of 45, with curly hair tied in a simple bun, her tanned skin weathered by time. She had no university degree. Her resume only listed a technical caregiver course and work experience in private homes. "Why are you interested in the position, Mrs. Santos?" Robert asked, trying to hide his initial disappointment. "My nephew Peter has autism," she answered, with an accent that hinted at her roots in rural Illinois. "I helped my sister raise him from his diagnosis until he turned 18. Today he has a job, a nearly independent life." Something in Irene's simplicity captured Robert's attention. She didn't use technical jargon. She didn't promise miracles. She spoke of Peter with a genuine smile in her eyes. "Every child is a universe, Mr. Miller. There are no magic formulas. There's patience, there's respecting their timing, and there's a lot of love." At the end of the interview, Robert still had doubts. Irene didn't possess the qualifications that Dr. Vance and her team boasted. But there was something about her, an authenticity, perhaps, that intrigued him. "Are you available to start next week?" "It would be a 1-month trial period." "I am. I just need to arrange a few things with my daughter." "Your daughter?" "Gabriella. She's 16. It's just the 2 of us since my husband left us 7 years ago. She's a responsible girl. She studies in the morning, but I need to figure out who will stay with her at night." Robert thought for a moment. He hadn't considered this possibility. A teenager could complicate the arrangement. On the other hand, something about Irene made him want to give her a chance. "If it's a problem for occasional overnight stays, perhaps we can find a solution," he said. "The important thing is that the child has the best possible care." The following week, Robert took Irene to see the house where she would supposedly work. In reality, it was a smaller property that Richard kept in the Gold Coast, another upscale city neighborhood used occasionally to host business partners. The place had been adapted to look like a family residence, with framed photos bought at flea markets and strategically placed personal items. "The boy lives here with his father," Robert explained, playing his role as an administrative employee. "The father is a very busy businessman, travels constantly. That's why he needs someone trustworthy to care for his son." "I understand," Irene said, observing the environment. "And when will I meet the boy and his father?" "The father is traveling. As for the boy, you'll meet him tomorrow. His name is Luke. He's almost 4. I'd like you to come and spend the day with him to see how you get along." The next day, Robert organized everything meticulously. He convinced Rebecca, the team coordinator, to bring Luke to the house in the Gold Coast, explaining that he was considering using the property for a new therapeutic project. Then he dismissed her, assuring her that he would stay with his son and the driver, actually a disguised Arthur, until the end of the day. When Irene arrived, she found Luke sitting on the living room rug, lining up small cars in a perfect row. Robert watched nervously, fearing the plan would fall apart at any moment. "Good morning, Luke," Irene said, without getting too close. She didn't try to touch the boy, didn't force eye contact. She just sat down at a respectful distance. "My name is Irene. I like cars a lot too." Luke didn't respond, nor did he look at her. He continued his activity with total concentration. "You're a very good organizer," she commented, after a few minutes of silence. "May I watch?" To Robert's surprise, Irene simply stayed there, quiet, watching Luke without making any demands. She didn't try to interrupt him, to apply behavioral techniques. She didn't insist on getting responses. She just respected the boy's space and time. After almost an hour, Luke finished lining up the cars. Then, unexpectedly, he picked up a red car and held it out in Irene's direction, still without looking at her directly. "Is this for me?" she asked softly. "Thank you, Luke. May I put it here?" She placed the car near the row, but not perfectly aligned. Luke watched for a few seconds, then adjusted the car to align it perfectly with the others. Robert watched, impressed. It was the first time he had seen Luke interact, even minimally, with someone new without showing discomfort. Normally, the presence of strangers made him agitated. At the end of the day, as Irene was leaving, Robert couldn't hold back the question, "What did you think of him?" "He's a beautiful boy, Mr. Miller. And very intelligent, you can tell. He lives in his own world, but there are bridges to reach him. We just have to respect his timing." Robert felt a lump in his throat. "Would you accept the job?" "It would be to start next week. Full-time, with the possibility of overnight stays when the father is traveling. I accept. But I have one condition," Irene said. "On weekends, when there's no need for an overnight stay, I'd like to bring my daughter with me sometimes. Gabriella is in her last year of high school. She studies a lot. I don't like leaving her alone for long periods." Robert hesitated. A teenager would complicate his plan. One more person to maintain the charade, more risks. "She's quiet, polite. She wouldn't be a bother," Irene assured him, noticing his hesitation. "In fact, I think it might even be good for Luke to be around her. Gabriella has a special way with children. She tutors the younger neighbors." Against his better judgment, Robert agreed. The most important thing was to ensure Luke was well cared for, and Irene seemed to be the right person for that. The following week, the plan was put into action. Luke was taken to the house in the Gold Coast 3 times a week, always under the pretext of participating in an experimental therapeutic program. Robert, in the role of administrative supervisor, would always be present to monitor progress. What no one knew, not even Irene, was that the house was equipped with discrete cameras that transmitted everything to Richard's phone and computer. He could watch every interaction, every moment, even when Robert wasn't there. In his empty mansion, Richard watched the recordings night after night. He saw Irene singing to Luke. He saw her respect his silences. He saw her create little rituals that brought the boy a sense of security. There were no sophisticated techniques, no complex reports. There was only a constant, patient, genuine presence. For the first time in years, Richard felt something different growing in his chest. It wasn't just hope for Luke's improvement. It was something deeper, more unsettling. The feeling that perhaps he had found not just someone to care for his son, but someone who could teach him how to be human again. What he couldn't predict was that his elaborate plan would soon face an unexpected element: Gabriella, Irene's daughter, whose unique perspective was about to transform not only Luke's life, but his own. Gabriela Santos arrived on a Saturday afternoon, carrying a worn backpack and an old guitar. She had the same expressive eyes as her mother, curly hair that fell over her shoulders, an air of shyness that contrasted with the evident curiosity in her gaze. Robert, still playing his role as an administrative employee, watched her with apprehension. A teenager meant more risks, more variables he couldn't control. "This is my daughter, Gabriella," Irene introduced, with clear pride. "Gabby, this is Mr. Miller, who supervises the project." "A pleasure," the girl said with a restrained smile. Luke was in the living room, focused on a puzzle. He didn't look up when the three entered. It had been 3 weeks since Irene started caring for him, and Robert noticed small changes, fewer meltdowns, longer periods of shared attention, less resistance to transitions between activities. "Is that Luke?" Gabriella asked, her mother in a low voice. "Yes. Remember what we talked about? He lives in his own world. We need to respect his space." To Robert's surprise, Gabriella didn't approach Luke immediately. Instead, she sat at the other end of the room, took her guitar out of its case, and began to tune the strings, seemingly paying no attention to the boy. Robert and Irene exchanged glances before retreating to the kitchen to prepare a snack. "Does your daughter have experience with autistic children?" Robert asked, while cutting some fruit. "Not specifically, but Gabriella has a natural gift for connecting with people. At school, she's always the one who includes the more isolated students. She has patience, she knows how to listen." In the living room, something unexpected was happening. Gabriella was gently strumming the guitar, playing a simple, repetitive melody. She didn't look directly at Luke, but she positioned herself so that he could see her without feeling observed. After a few minutes, Luke lifted his eyes from the puzzle. His fingers, previously busy with the pieces, were now drumming on the rug, following the rhythm of the music. When Robert and Irene returned to the living room with the snack, they found a surprising scene. Luke was sitting less than a meter away from Gabriella, still not looking at her directly, but visibly aware of her presence. The girl continued to play, as if she were alone, without making any demand for interaction. "He likes music," Gabriella commented, without interrupting the melody. "I noticed he moves differently when I play certain chords that afternoon." Robert watched, fascinated, as Gabriella established a form of silent communication with Luke. She didn't use words, didn't seek physical contact, didn't ask questions. She just existed in the same space as him, offering music as an invisible bridge between two worlds. Before leaving, Gabriella left the guitar leaning against the wall. Luke, who normally ignored objects that weren't part of his routine, approached it and timidly plucked the strings, producing a dissonant sound. "You can keep it until next weekend," Gabriella said, addressing the air, without looking directly at Luke. "Then I'll come back and we can play together." On the way back to the mansion, with Luke asleep in the back seat of the car, Richard, no longer Robert at that moment, reflected on what he had witnessed. There was something special in the way Gabriella approached Luke, without expectations, without pressure, just pure acceptance. It was so different from the structured therapies, the rigid schedules, the developmental goals that dictated the boy's life. In the days that followed, Richard noticed that Luke sought out the guitar several times. Rebecca, the therapeutic team coordinator, was surprised by this new interest. "He's never shown an attraction to musical instruments before," she commented, making notes on her clipboard. "We could introduce music therapy into the program." Richard just nodded, but internally he smiled, realizing it wasn't the technique that attracted Luke to music, but the natural and unpretentious way Gabriella had presented it. The following Saturday, as promised, Gabriella returned. This time, she also brought a small handmade drum. "It's easier to play than the guitar," she explained to Robert. "I thought Luke might like to feel the vibration." And so a routine began. Every Saturday, Gabriella came with her mother to the house in the Gold Coast, while Irene prepared nutritious meals and kept the house in order. The teenager created a space of music and acceptance for Luke. She never forced interactions, never set goals, never turned their meetings into sessions. She just shared what she loved at the pace the boy could follow. In the role of Robert, Richard watched in amazement as his son blossomed in the presence of the two. With Irene, Luke learned to accept small changes in his routine without becoming completely disorganized. With Gabriella, he discovered the pleasure of making sounds, of feeling vibrations, of existing in a shared space without feeling invaded. One day, after almost 2 months of this routine, something extraordinary happened. Luke was sitting next to Gabriella, both taking turns playing the drum, when the boy, for the first time, looked directly at her. It wasn't a fleeting glance, like the ones he sometimes gave Irene. It was a sustained, conscious, present gaze. And then, without warning, he smiled. A small, restrained, but undeniably real smile. Robert, watching from the kitchen, felt his eyes well up. In all the specialists' reports, in all the evaluations, one phrase was repeated: absence of spontaneous social smile. And there he was, his son, smiling at a girl who had no degrees, followed no methodologies, but was simply, truly present. That night, in his rented apartment in Lakeview, Richard couldn't sleep. His original plan was simply to find someone who would care for Luke with genuine affection, someone who would see his son beyond the diagnosis. But now he realized he had found much more. Irene and Gabriella were slowly rebuilding not only Luke's world, but also his own. There was, however, a growing problem. The more time he spent with them as Robert, the harder it became to sustain the lie. He was beginning to genuinely enjoy Irene's company, her stories about life in the countryside, her simple and direct wisdom. And he admired Gabriella, her artistic sensitivity, her intuitive understanding of Luke, her surprising maturity for her age. In his role as administrative employee, Robert often shared coffee with Irene in the kitchen, while Gabriella was gradually in the living room. The conversations became more personal. Robert spoke of his supposed life as a widower, raising a son alone in a small town before moving to Chicago. Irene told him about her struggles as a single mother, about how she had raised Gabriella by working in private homes, about her dreams of one day returning to school. "I always wanted to be a teacher," she confessed on a rainy afternoon. "But life took other turns. When John, my husband, left us, Gabriella was 9. I had to choose between paying for college or putting food on the table." "You're strong," Robert said, with sincere admiration. "You raised an incredible daughter." "I was lucky. Gabriella was born with her own light. Even in the toughest times, she found beauty in the little things." On a particularly hot Saturday in February, Robert suggested a trip to Lincoln Park. It was a risk, he knew. Luke rarely reacted well to changes in environment, but in recent weeks, with Irene's guidance, the boy had been adapting better to small alterations in his routine. "We can try," Irene said, "but we need to prepare everything. Water, snacks he likes, his favorite toys, and we'll have to be vigilant for signs of discomfort." The outing was a revelation. In the nearly empty park that Saturday morning, Luke walked calmly, holding Gabriella's hand. From time to time, he would stop to observe insects or touch the texture of a plant. He sat under a leafy tree, listening to Gabriella play her guitar, which she had insisted on bringing. He even agreed to try some ice cream, something he had never done before without resistance. Robert discreetly took photos with his phone, not for the file of evidence he had initially planned to create, but to capture moments he had never imagined possible. Luke smiling as he felt the wind on his face. Luke intently observing a beetle on Gabriella's palm. Luke asleep in Irene's lap, under the dappled shade of a maple tree. On the way back, with Luke sleeping peacefully in the back seat, Gabriella broke the silence. "Mr. Miller, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, Gabriella. Why is Luke's father never around?" "We've been with him for almost 3 months, and we've never seen his dad." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. This question was inevitable, he knew. He had prepared an answer, but now looking in the rearview mirror at Gabriella's sincere and curious face, the rehearsed words felt inadequate. "His work requires a lot of travel," he finally said. "He communicates with me to know how Luke is progressing, but he doesn't even come back on weekends," Gabriella insisted. "Luke misses him, you can tell." "What do you mean?" Robert asked, genuinely intrigued. "When Luke hears a man's voice on TV, or when he sees other fathers picking up kids from school, ... He looks, with his eyes, like he's waiting for someone who never comes." Robert swallowed hard, feeling the weight of guilt like never before. His son missed him, even when he was right there. The painful irony was not lost on him. He had distanced himself to try to get closer, and now he was further away than ever. "Luke's father has his difficulties," he said, choosing his words carefully. "He doesn't always know how to connect with his son. That's why he trusts me, Paul, like you and your mother. But it's so simple," Gabriella replied, with the innocence of someone who doesn't yet fully understand the complications of adult life. "Luke doesn't need special things. He just needs someone who is really there, seeing him as he is, not as we'd like him to be." That night, alone in his apartment in Lakeview, Richard cried for the first time since Helen's funeral. He cried for the lost time, for the smiles he hadn't seen, for the moments he had outsourced. He cried because a 16-year-old girl had, in a few words, exposed the truth he had refused to see for so long. It wasn't Luke who couldn't connect. It was he who didn't know how to be truly present. What Richard didn't know, as he dealt with his painful epiphany, was that his carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. Less than a mile away, in the elegant Serenade Tower in the Gold Coast, Claudia Porter, a condo board member and a well-known socialite in Chicago's high society, was examining with growing interest the comings and goings at the house that supposedly housed an experimental therapeutic project by Morgan Developments. Claudia Porter could not abide mysteries in her territory. At 58, the widow of a judge and heiress to a real estate fortune, she considered herself the unofficial guardian of morals and good taste in the elegant Gold Coast neighborhood. She was the one who organized the most exclusive charity events, who determined which families would be accepted into the social circles that mattered, who kept a mental list of all the secrets, scandals, and gossip that circulated through the mansions and luxury apartments of the area. "Thomas, are you sure it's a Morgan Developments project?" she asked the building manager as they had coffee on the balcony of her penthouse apartment. "That's what I was told, Mrs. Porter. A therapeutic project for special needs children. Everything is above board, and this Robert Miller fellow. Who is he?" "An administrative employee from the company, from what I understand. He seems to be in charge of the project." Claudia drummed her perfectly manicured nails on the marble table. Something didn't add up. She knew Richard Morgan from social events and newspaper headlines. The businessman was known for his almost obsessive privacy, especially after the tragedy with his wife. Why would he place such a project so close to his own residence, risking exposing his autistic son to the prying eyes of the neighborhood and the woman and the girl? Who are they? As far as I know, they're caregivers hired to look after the child. Claudia smiled to herself. Something was wrong with this story, and she loved uncovering other people's secrets, especially when they involved powerful figures like Richard Morgan. Meanwhile, oblivious to Claudia's growing curiosity, Richard, Irene, and Gabriella were establishing an increasingly harmonious routine with Luke. The boy, who once reacted with distress to any change in his environment, now accepted small alterations without becoming completely disorganized. He was beginning to use his gaze to communicate desires, to seek physical proximity when he felt safe, and to express his preferences more clearly. On one particularly significant morning, Luke surprised everyone by taking Irene's hand and guiding her to the refrigerator, pointing to the orange juice he wanted to drink. A seemingly simple gesture, but one that represented an extraordinary leap for a child who, months earlier, communicated primarily through behavioral crises. "He's finding ways to express himself," Irene explained to Robert, as they watched Luke draw colorful circles on a sheet of paper. "When we are willing to truly see someone, that person finds the courage to show themselves." Robert, or rather, Richard behind the mask of Robert, felt his heart transforming with each new day. The guilt was still there, the grief for Helen too, but now there was something else. Hope. And surprisingly, there was also a growing warmth in his chest whenever he talked with Irene during their long coffees in the kitchen, while Gabriella played guitar for Luke in the living room. "My daughter is asking about Luke's father again," Irene commented one afternoon in May. "She's worried. She says he needs his father's presence, not just caregivers." Robert swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the lie he was sustaining. "Luke's father has his reasons," he replied, avoiding Irene's gaze. "It's not always easy to face a child's limitations." "Limitations?" Irene raised an eyebrow. "Luke isn't limited, Mr. Miller. He just perceives and interacts with the world differently than we do. The ones who are limited are those who can't see the beauty in that." Those simple words, spoken without any theoretical or academic pretense, struck Richard like a revelation. For years, he had seen Luke's autism as a problem to be managed, a condition to be mitigated, an obstacle to be overcome with therapies, medications, and interventions. He had never considered that perhaps the biggest obstacle was his own inability to accept and understand the unique way his son existed in the world. That night, after leaving Luke at the mansion in the care of the night staff, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He sat on the edge of his son's bed and just stayed there, watching him sleep. Not as a case to be analyzed, not as a responsibility to be fulfilled, but as his son, a complete, unique human being, perfect in his difference. In the days that followed, Richard began to implement small changes at the mansion. He dismissed some of the more technical and impersonal specialists. He asked Rebecca to revise the schedules to include more free time, fewer structured therapies. He requested that music be incorporated into Luke's daily routine, not as formal music therapy, but as a constant presence, a channel for expression and connection. Meanwhile, as Robert, he continued to build an ever-closer relationship with Irene and Gabriella. He noticed how his heart raced when Irene arrived in the morning, how he appreciated the calm and confident way she handled every situation, how her smile brought a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since before Helen's passing. "You should see Gabriella's performance at school, Mr. Miller," Irene invited one Friday. "She's going to play the guitar and sing. She always gets nervous, says she has no one in the audience cheering for her but me. I'd love to go," Robert replied, genuinely interested. "When is it?" "Tomorrow night." "I know it's a Saturday, but I thought maybe, a double quotes, I'll be there," he assured her, without hesitation. The auditorium of Northwood High School was packed when Robert arrived, feeling strangely out of place among casually dressed teenage parents, so different from the corporate environment he was used to. He located Irene in the third row and sat next to her, surprised by his own nervousness. When Gabriella took the stage, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying her worn guitar, Robert felt a wave of pride that caught him off guard. He wasn't her father, he had barely known her for a few months, but there he was, rooting for her as if she were family. Gabriella's voice was surprisingly powerful for someone so young. She sang an original composition, a song about seeing stars where others see only darkness, about finding languages where others hear only silence. Robert didn't have to be very perceptive to understand that the song was about Luke. At the end of the performance, the audience applauded enthusiastically. Robert saw tears in Irene's eyes and, to his surprise, felt his own eyes well up. "She's incredible," he commented, as they waited for Gabriella in the lobby after the show. "She's my greatest pride," Irene replied, with a smile that lit up her entire face. "Everything I've done in life was so she could follow her dreams. And what are those dreams? Gabriella wants to study music therapy. She discovered this calling after she started working with Luke. She says she's found her purpose." That night marked a subtle but significant shift in the relationship between the three. They were no longer just an administrative employee and his contractors. There was something else being born there, a friendship perhaps, or something deeper that none of them were ready to name. The following Sunday, Robert invited Irene and Gabriella for lunch at his modest apartment in Lakeview. He cooked himself, following a pasta recipe he found online. The result was far from perfect, but the laughter shared during the simple meal brought Richard a sense of normalcy he hadn't experienced in years. While they were washing the dishes, Irene and Robert were alone in the small kitchen. Their fingers brushed briefly as they passed a plate, and they both felt an electric current run through their bodies. They stood in silence for a moment, aware of a new and pleasant tension between them. "Thank you for today," Robert finally said. "For everything you've done for Luke." "It's our job," Irene replied. But her tone suggested it was much more than that. "No, it's not just a job, and we both know it." Their eyes met, and for an instant, Robert almost confessed everything, who he really was, why he had created this elaborate lie, how he felt torn between guilt and his growing affection for her. But the moment passed, and the opportunity was lost when Gabriella entered the kitchen, excited to show them a new song she was composing. What none of them noticed was the black car parked discreetly across the street, from which Claudia Porter was watching with increasing interest. She had followed Irene from the Gold Coast to Lakeview. Intrigued by the seemingly close relationship between the caregiver and the supposed administrative employee of Morgan Developments. The next morning, Claudia paid a visit to the company's headquarters in a corporate tower on Wacker Drive, dressed impeccably and using her late husband's name as a credential. She managed to secure a brief meeting with the Director of Human Resources. "Robert Miller," the man repeated, confused. "We don't have any employee by that name involved in social or therapeutic projects. Are you sure?" "He's supervising a project for children with special needs in a house in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Mrs. Porter, I assure you, we have no such project underway. All our social programs are conducted through the Morgan Institute, and none of them involve residential homes in the Gold Coast." Claudia smiled to herself. Something was wrong, just as she suspected, and she was determined to find out exactly what the mysterious Robert Miller was hiding. Meanwhile, oblivious to the gathering threat, Richard was facing his own dilemma. The charade he had created was becoming unsustainable, not just because of the growing possibility of being discovered, but because, for the first time in years, he wanted to be truthful with someone. He wanted Irene to know him as he really was, not the powerful businessman Richard Morgan, nor the modest employee Robert Miller, but the man behind the masks, with his flaws, his fears, and his newly discovered hopes. On one particularly significant afternoon, Luke did something no specialist had predicted. Upon hearing Gabriella play a soft melody on the guitar, he approached Robate and spontaneously held out his arms to be hugged. It was a brief, almost fleeting gesture, but its emotional impact was overwhelming. "He trusts you," Irene commented, with tears in her eyes. "That's rare, precious." Robert hugged the boy, feeling his small body relax against his. It wasn't a hug between a supervisor and a child under his care. It was a hug between a father and son, genuine, true, without masks or pretenses. In that moment, Richard knew he had to end the charade. He needed to gather the courage to reveal the truth, no matter the cost. Luke deserved a real father, not a shadow split between two identities. Irene and Gabriella deserved honesty, not manipulation, however well-intentioned it might have been. "Irene," he began, after Luke had fallen asleep on the sofa, "there's something important I need to tell you. Something about me, about Luke, ... Couple quotes. It was the
Before
Doorman
he could continue,
announcing
the
an
intercom
unexpected
buzzed.
visit. Social workers from Child Protective Services, accompanied by a woman who identified herself as Claudia Porter, a neighborhood council member. Therefore, an urgent inspection based on an anonymous tip about a possible irregularity involving a child. The house of cards was beginning to crumble. "Masks off, don't answer," Robert said, holding Irene's arm before she could reach the intercom. His face had lost all its color. "Please trust me. It's not what it looks like." "What are you talking about?" Irene pulled away, confused. "They're social workers. If there's a complaint, we need to clear it up. We can't. Not like this." The intercom buzzed again, more insistent. On the sofa, Luke began to stir at the repetitive sound, his hands covering his ears. "Mr. Miller, what's going on?" Irene's voice now held a note of apprehension. "Is there something you're not telling me about this project?" About Luke. Robert, or rather Richard, found himself cornered. The house of cards he had so carefully built was about to collapse. He felt the crushing weight of the lie, the imminent judgment in the eyes of the woman for whom he had developed real feelings. "Irene, please listen to me," he pleaded, as the intercom continued to buzz. "There is no project. This house doesn't belong to Morgan Developments. It belongs to me. Luke is not the son of an absent businessman. He's my son." "Your son?" Irene took a step back, incredulous. "But you said you were just an administrative employee. That you supervised the project. Double quotes, "My name isn't Robert Miller. I'm Richard Morgan, the owner of Morgan Developments." The silence that followed was deafening. Irene looked at him as if she were seeing a stranger, her eyes registering the betrayal, the manipulation, the elaborate lie that had shaped their entire relationship for the past few months. "Why?" was all she could manage to say, her voice barely a whisper. Before Richard could answer, the sound of the downstairs door opening echoed through the apartment. Someone had let them into the building. Hurried footsteps were coming up the stairs. "I needed to find someone who would care for Luke for who he is, not for the money. Not for the position," Richard explained quickly, desperate for her to understand before it was too late. "Someone who would see my son as a person, not a clinical case. Someone who, double quotes. Firm knocks on the door interrupted his desperate confession. Gabriella, who had been watching the scene with wide eyes from the other side of the room, moved closer to Luke, instinctively protecting him. "Police and social services." "Open the door, please," an authoritative voice announced from the other side. Irene, still in shock, cast one last look at the man she had known as Robert, now revealed to be Richard Morgan, one of Chicago's most powerful businessmen, before heading to the door. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment and restrained anger. The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare. 2 social workers, a police detective, and Claudia Porter, the latter observing everything with ill-disguised satisfaction, entered the apartment. "Mr. Morgan," the detective said, clearly surprised to recognize him, "we received a report of a possible kidnapping and inadequate conditions involving a child. Can you explain what's happening here?" "Kidnapping," Richard repeated. "Luke is my son. I can prove that with documents." "Then why all this deception?" questioned one of the social workers, while the other cautiously approached Luke, who was beginning to show clear signs of distress at the presence of strangers. "Why pretend to be someone else? Why keep your son in questionable conditions?" "There is nothing questionable here," Irene intervened, regaining her composure. Despite the betrayal she had just discovered, her instinct to protect Luke was stronger. "The child is well cared for, well fed, and in a safe and welcoming environment. Are you a professional caregiver?" the social worker asked, with evident suspicion. "Do you have specific training to deal with autistic children?" "I have personal experience and a technical caregiver certificate," Irene replied, maintaining her dignity, "and more importantly, I have the necessary respect and love." Claudia Porter, who had been watching the scene with a triumphant expression, stepped forward. "It's a very strange situation, don't you think?" one of the richest men in Illinois pretending to be a common employee, hiring a woman with no formal qualifications and her teenage daughter to care for a special child, all in secret. Nothing was in secret, Richard protested, his desperation growing as he saw Luke becoming more and more agitated by the commotion. Gabriella was hugging the boy, trying to calm him, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. I just wanted to find people who would genuinely care about my son, not my money or status. Gentlemen, please, Gabriella intervened, with a maturity surprising for her 16 years. Luke is getting very nervous. He doesn't handle changes in routine or tense environments well. You are causing real harm to him right now. The second social worker, who had been observing Luke more closely, confirmed Gabriella's assessment. The girl is right. The child is entering a sensory crisis. At that moment, Luke began to clap his hands over his ears and emit high-pitched sounds. His face contorted in pure anguish. Gabriella tried to soothe him, humming softly the melody that always calmed him, but this time it wasn't working. Please, Richard begged, let us calm my son down first. Then we can clarify everything. We will answer all your questions. The detective exchanged glances with the social workers, who nodded. They all stepped back a little, giving Irene and Gabriella space to handle the situation. Even hurt by the revelation of Robert's true identity, Irene took control, instructing Gabriella to take Luke to the bedroom while she prepared his favorite drink, orange juice with star-shaped ice cubes, one of the little routines they had established to calm him in difficult moments. When the bedroom door closed, leaving Luke in Gabriella's care, Richard faced the unwelcome visitors. I can prove that I am Luke's legal and legitimate father, he said, regaining some of his usual firmness. I have all the necessary documents. There has been no crime, just an attempt, perhaps misguided, I admit, to find the best for my son. He took his phone from his pocket and made a quick call. Arthur, I need you to come to the Lakeview apartment immediately. Bring all the documents related to Luke. Yes, everything. The birth certificate, the medical reports, everything. And called Dr. Richard Myers. He looked pointedly at the detective as he mentioned the name of the renowned criminal lawyer. Tell him we need him here as soon as possible. He hung up and faced Claudia Porter, who now seemed slightly less confident. You made a false report of kidnapping, Mrs. Porter. That is a crime, and I have the resources to ensure the law is applied. Claudia paled slightly, but maintained her arrogant posture. I was just doing my civic duty. A man everyone knows as single, childless, suddenly appears with a child in a modest apartment, under a false identity, accompanied by an unqualified woman and a teenager. What would you think? I would think that perhaps there were explanations beyond the most thwarted ones, Irene interjected, coming out of the kitchen with Luke's juice in her hands, and before involving authorities and traumatizing a vulnerable child. It might be wise to investigate further. The look she gave Richard made it clear that, while she was defending him against Claudia, she had not yet forgiven him for the lie. Over the next 2 hours, the situation gradually became clear. Arthur arrived with the documents proving Richard's paternity. Dr. Myers, in a video conference, assured the authorities there was no legal basis for any criminal charges. Luke, finally calmed by Irene's gentle techniques and Gabriella's soft music, had fallen into an exhausted sleep. When the authorities finally left, with a reluctant apology from the detective and a promise of non-intrusive follow-up by social services, Claudia Porter, at the door, was the last to resist one last jab. The great Richard Morgan, reduced to pathetic lies and disguises. What a disappointment, for Chicago's high society. Richard didn't respond. The opinions of the city's social elite were the least of his concerns at that moment. All that mattered was, inside that apartment, his son, finally sleeping peacefully after the trauma, and the two women whose trust he had betrayed. When the door closed behind Claudia, a heavy silence settled in the room. Irene stood by the window, looking out at the night falling over the city. Gabriella remained in the room with Luke, standing guard over his sleep. "Irene, I don't," she interrupted, without turning around. "Not now. You lied to us for months. You used us as part of some bizarre social experiment. You watched us, tested us, judged us, as if we were lab rats." "It wasn't like that," Richard protested, approaching cautiously. "In the beginning, yes, I just wanted to find someone genuine for Luke. But then, when I met you two, when I saw how you transformed him, how you transformed me, everything changed, transformed." She turned now, revealing tear-filled but steady eyes. "What exactly changed, Mr. Morgan? Your view on caregivers? Your understanding of your son? Or just your guilty conscience?" Her words hit Richard like physical blows. There was truth in them, a truth he wasn't fully prepared to face. "Everything," he finally answered. "You changed everything. For the first time since Helen was gone, I saw my son as he truly is, not as a problem to be managed, but as a whole person with his own way of being in the world. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something other than guilt and obligation." "Feel what?" "Connection, hope." He paused, gathering courage. "And for you, Irene, something I didn't think I would feel again." She looked away, visibly disturbed by the confession. "Feelings based on lies aren't real, Mr. Morgan." "Richard," he corrected her softly. "My name is Richard." "And you're right. I can't ask you to believe anything I say now. I can only ask for a chance to prove with actions, not words, that the only true thing in this whole charade were my feelings. For Luke, for Gabriella, for you." At that moment, Gabriella came out of the room, closing the door silently behind her. Her young face showed a mixture of disappointment and restrained anger, she reported, without looking directly at Richard. "But he's going to need a lot of stability in the coming days. Today's trauma could cause a regression." "Thank you, Gabriella," Richard said, feeling the weight of responsibility for the suffering he had caused. "I am so sorry for all of this." "It's not me you should be apologizing to," the teenager replied, with surprising maturity. "It's Luke. He trusted you. We trusted you." Her voice broke on the last sentence, revealing the depth of the wound. "Let's go, Mum," she continued, turning to Irene. "Please." Irene hesitated, torn between her hurt and her genuine concern for Luke. "He's going to need us tomorrow," she finally said. "We can't just disappear from his life. That would be another traumatic rupture." "So what do we do?" Gabriella asked, the tears finally escaping. "Pretend nothing happened, that we weren't deceived, that we weren't used as part of some sick game by a bored rich man." "It wasn't that," Richard protested, but his voice was lost in Gabriella's accusing gaze. "I believed in you," the teenager continued. "I thought you really cared about Luke, that you really saw what we were building with him. I even thought ... She cut herself off, unable to continue. "Thought what, Gabriella?" Richard insisted, needing to hear it, no matter how painful. "That maybe you and my mum, that maybe we could be a family. A real family for Luke." She angrily wiped her tears. What a fool I was. Her outburst struck Richard and Irene like a revelation. The teenager had seen what they themselves had refused to admit, the bond growing between all of them, the possibility of mutual healing, of rebuilding. "Let's go home," Irene decided finally. "We'll think clearly tomorrow. But we'll come back, Gabriella." For Luke, he's not to blame for his father's choices. Richard didn't try to stop them. He knew any argument at that moment would only deepen the wound. When the door closed behind them, he felt the crushing weight of loneliness, a loneliness that, for the first time in years, bothered him deeply. He went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed where Luke was sleeping. His son looked so small, so vulnerable. The mask of the powerful businessman, the man who controlled everything, who needed no one, had finally fallen. And what was left was just a father full of flaws and regrets. Finally facing the most painful truth of all, he had lost Helen, yes, but it was his choice to keep losing Luke every day. That night, Richard Morgan made a silent promise to his sleeping son. It would no longer be a promise of protection from a distance, of financial security, of unlimited resources. It was a promise of presence, of imperfect but true love. A promise to be there, really there, regardless of what the future held. What he didn't know, as he watched over Luke's restless sleep, was that Irene, in her modest apartment in the Logan Square neighborhood, was making a similar promise. Despite the betrayal, despite the hurt, she would not abandon the boy who had won her heart. Not even her disappointment in the father could erase the love she felt for the son. And Gabriella, lying in her bed, was silently composing a new song in her mind. No longer about stars in the darkness, but about broken bridges that perhaps could still be rebuilt. The days that followed were the most difficult in Richard's life since Helen's passing. Luke, deeply shaken by the traumatic episode, regressed in several areas. He went back to avoiding eye contact, intensified his repetitive behaviors, and resisted changes with increasingly frequent meltdowns. It was as if all the progress of the past few months had been swept away by a single night of chaos. Irene and Gabriella, true to their promise, returned the next morning. There was no warmth in their gazes, no old camaraderie, just a distant professionalism, especially from Gabriella. On the other hand, maintained the same care and dedication with Luke, though she avoided addressing Richard directly whenever possible. In the first few weeks after the revelation, the mansion in Kenilworth became the center of operations. Richard had dismissed most of the technical team, keeping only Rebecca as a coordinator and a trusted occupational therapist. Irene took on the role of primary caregiver, with Gabriella assisting on weekends and evenings. The farce of the Lakeview apartment and the Robert Miller identity was over. Now, it was Richard Morgan who dealt directly with his son, without intermediaries, without masks. "He needs stability now," Irene explained. On one of the rare occasions she spoke directly to Richard in the first few weeks. "Every change in routine is perceived as a threat. We need to rebuild trust step by step." Richard nodded, listening with a humility he had never shown before. There was something liberating with no longer having to pretend to be someone he wasn't, in being able to learn openly from Irene's simple and direct wisdom. A month after the incident, Richard made a decision that surprised the financial market and Chicago's high society. At a press conference, he announced that he was drastically reducing his operational role at Morgan Developments, delegating the CEO position to Gregory Townsend, his right-hand man for over a decade. He would remain as chairman of the board, but would dedicate most of his time to a new project, the New Perspectives Institute, a non-profit organization dedicated to families living with autism. The institute was born from a personal experience, he explained to the journalists, breaking years of silence about his private life. My son Luke was diagnosed with severe autism almost 2 years ago. Like many parents, I sought the best therapies, the best specialists, but I discovered, in the process, that the most important thing isn't techniques or methods, but how we see our children as whole people, not as diagnoses to be corrected. The news spread quickly. Richard Morgan, the hermetic businessman, the widower who rarely appeared at social events after the tragedy with his wife, now revealed himself as the father of an autistic child and a champion of a more humanized approach to autism treatment. The newspapers ran sensational headlines, social media buzzed with speculation, and Claudia Porter and her circle commented maliciously on the fall of the powerful businessman. Richard ignored it all. His attention was entirely focused on 2 parallel projects, consolidating the New Perspectives Institute and slowly, patiently rebuilding his relationship with Luke, Irene. For the institute, Gabriella, he rented a historic mansion in the Old Town neighborhood, surrounded by ancient trees and a large garden. The place was carefully adapted to welcome neurodivergent children and their families. It wouldn't be a traditional therapeutic center, but a space for support, sharing experiences, and developing approaches centered on potential, not limitations. "I want you to lead the team," he said to Irene one late afternoon as they watched Luke play in the mansion's garden. It was the first time in weeks they had spoken beyond what was strictly necessary. "You understand what we're aiming for better than any PhD we could hire." Irene looked at him in surprise. Her features, previously always tense in his presence, softened slightly. "I don't have the formal qualifications, Mr. Morgan, Richard," he corrected her gently. "And you have the only qualification that really matters. You know how to see beyond the diagnosis. You know how to find the person behind the behavior. That's what you did with Luke. That's what we want to offer other families." "Why?" she finally asked. The question had been hanging between them for weeks. Why all that deception? Why not just say who you were from the beginning? Richard took a deep breath, organizing thoughts he had revisited countless times during sleepless nights since the revelation. "Because I was lost, Irene. As lost as Luke, just in different ways. Helen was gone at the very moment our family was supposed to begin. She left me with a son I didn't know how to love. I turned my guilt and fear into an obsession with control. I hired the best specialists, created the most sophisticated structure, spent fortunes trying to fix Luke, but nothing worked. He seemed more and more distant, and I felt more and more like a failure as a father." He paused, recalling the incident with Dr. Vance that had triggered everything. "When I saw that renowned specialist causing my son to suffer in the name of a scientifically proven methodology, something inside me broke. I realized I had outsourced not just his care, but my own responsibility as a father. And it dawned on me that, as Richard Morgan, the powerful businessman, I would never find someone who saw Luke before they saw my fortune or position." Irene listened in silence, her face an impenetrable mask. The idea for the disguise came as a desperate experiment. I wanted to find someone who cared genuinely, someone who could teach me how to be a real father. I never imagined I would find you too. That I would find ... double quotes. He hesitated. That I would find a family. The word hung between them, laden with meaning and unrealized possibilities. What started as a search for a caregiver turned into something much bigger. You didn't just change Luke, you changed me. And when I realized that when I started to feel things I had buried along with Helen, I got scared. Scared of losing what we were building if I revealed the truth, and you ended up losing it anyway," Irene concluded, though her tone was no longer accusatory, just one of sad acknowledgement. "Yes, and it's my responsibility to rebuild it, if possible. Not just for Luke, but for all of us." She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze returned to Luke, who was now playing with colorful pebbles under Gabriella's distant supervision. "I accept the position at the Institute," she said finally. "Not for you, but because I believe in the project. Because other children deserve to be seen as Luke finally was. Other parents need to learn what you, despite everything, have learnt." It was a small step, not a full reconciliation, but enough to light a flame of hope in Richard's heart. In the following weeks, Irene immersed herself in developing the Institute with surprising executive competence. For someone without a higher education, she showed a remarkable capacity for organization and leadership. She recruited a diverse team, some conventional specialists, yes, but also artists, musicians, alternative educators, and parents of autistic children. People who, like her, believe that the way to help neurodivergent children was through accepting and celebrating their differences, not by trying to normalize them at all costs. Now, Gabriella also found her place in high school, a teenager. With the support of a professional music therapist, developed a program of musical expression for nonverbal children. It was her idea for the Institute to have integrated spaces where neurotypical and neurodivergent children could interact and learn from one another. "Luke needs this," she explained to Richard in a rare moment when she addressed him directly. It was the first real conversation they'd had since the night of the revelation. "He needs a world bigger than the mansion, than our family. He needs to learn to exist in diverse spaces, to find his place among different kinds of people. I'm afraid," Richard confessed. "Afraid he'll suffer, that he'll be rejected, that he'll get frustrated." "Of course you are," Gabriella replied, with a wisdom beyond her years. "That fear is part of being a parent. But you can't let your fear become his prison. Luke's life will be hard sometimes. There will be people who don't understand him, situations that will challenge him. Our job isn't to protect him from all of that, but to equip him to face the world in his own way." Richard looked at the teenager with admiration. In just over 6 months, she had transformed from a shy girl into a confident and eloquent young woman. Her passion for working with neurodivergent children had crystallized into a definite calling. She had decided to study music therapy after finishing high school. "You're right," he agreed after a moment of reflection. "And I promise I'll do everything I can to give him that opportunity." The New Perspectives Institute was inaugurated on a sunny September morning. The garden of the mansion in Old Town was filled with families, some from Chicago's elite, drawn by Richard Morgan's name, but mostly ordinary families from various neighborhoods and social classes, united by the shared experience of raising neurodivergent children. Luke, surprisingly, attended the ceremony. He didn't stay long among the crowd, of course, preferring to explore the quieter corners of the garden. But he was there, wearing a t-shirt printed with the Institute's logo, a colorful kaleidoscope forming an eye, and occasionally accepting brief interactions with other children. During his inaugural speech, Richard kept it simple and direct. He was no longer the calculating businessman who measured every word for its strategic impact. He was just a father sharing a journey of transformation. "This institute is not just a place for neurodivergent children," he explained, looking directly at Irene, who was in the front row. "It is a space to transform our perspective, to learn to see differences not as problems to be corrected, but as unique expressions of humanity." After the ceremony, as families explored the Institute's facilities, Richard found a moment to speak with Irene alone. Nearly 4 months had passed since the night of the revelation. The relationship between them, once tense and formal, had gradually evolved into a cautious mutual respect, a professional partnership that occasionally made room for more personal conversations. "You did it," she said, with a genuine smile. "You turned an idea into reality." "We did it," Richard corrected. "Without you, without Gabriella, this would just be another conventional therapeutic center. You gave the project a soul." They walked together through the garden, watching the children play on the adaptive equipment, the families talking, the social and economic barriers temporarily suspended in the name of a common cause. "I wanted to ask you something," Richard finally said. "Not as the director of the Institute, not as your employer, just as a man who made mistakes, who is trying to rebuild what he destroyed." Irene looked at him with a cautious but not hostile expression. "A chance," he continued. "A dinner. Just the two of us. No lies, no roles to play. Just Richard and Irene." She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze swept across the garden, resting on Gabriella, who was playing guitar under a tree, surrounded by fascinated children, and on Luke, who was watching from a distance, swaying gently to the rhythm of the music. "Why?" she finally asked. "What do you hope to achieve, Richard?" "Nothing specific, just a new beginning. An opportunity to get to know each other for real. No expectations, no pressure." Irene hesitated. The betrayal still hurt. But their interactions over the past few months had shown a different Richard, different from the arrogant businessman, and different from the humble Robert, an imperfect man striving to be better for his son, for himself. "One dinner," she finally agreed. "But let's take it slow. There's a lot of water to pass under that bridge." The following week, Richard took Irene to a simple restaurant at the city market. No fancy places, no ostentation, just good, authentic food in an unpretentious setting. They talked for hours, not as boss and employee, not as father and caregiver, but as two people with stories of loss and new beginnings. He spoke about Helen, about the grief he never properly processed, about how he turned pain into walls around his heart. She told him about John, the husband who abandoned her, about the hardships of raising Gabriella alone, about the dreams deferred in the name of survival. It was just one dinner, with no grand declarations, no grandiose promises. But it was a start. In the months that followed, the New Perspectives Institute flourished, attracting national attention as a model for a humanized approach to autism. Richard used his influence to push for more inclusive public policies, to expand access to resources for low-income families, and to challenge the purely medical view of autism that still dominated the system. But his greatest transformation happened within the confines of his own family. Luke, now 5, continued to surprise everyone with his progress. These weren't advancements measured by charts or comparisons with neurotypical children, but significant personal achievements, an expanded, albeit limited, vocabulary, a greater tolerance for change, the ability to express emotions. Irene remained a constant presence, now not just as a caregiver or the Institute's director, but as a friend, a confidant, and gradually something more. Gabriella accepted into university to study music therapy, divided her time between her studies and volunteer work at the institute. She had forgiven Richard, not all at once, but in small gestures over time, a smile here, a shared joke there, a renewed trust, step by step. On a sunny afternoon in May, almost a year after the revelation that nearly destroyed everything, Luke did something extraordinary. They were all in the mansion's garden: Richard, Irene, Gabriella, and the boy. Luke approached the adults who were talking under the shade of a leafy tree, took Richard's hand and then Irene's hand. Then, in a simple but profoundly significant gesture, he joined their two hands together. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Gabriella was the first to break it, with a radiant smile. "Looks like someone is trying to tell us something," she commented, her eyes welling up. Richard and Irene looked at each other, their hands still joined by Luke's deliberate gesture. They were no longer the powerful businessman and the humble caregiver. They were just a man and a woman, united by a boy who in his own unique way had taught them both the true meaning of love. 3 months later, in a simple ceremony held in the Institute's garden, Richard and Irene were married. Luke, dressed in a small suit that he admirably tolerated for almost an hour, carried the rings, a task that required weeks of preparation and practice, but which he completed with surprising concentration. Gabriella, now officially Richard's stepdaughter and about to turn 18, played the guitar and sang an original composition, a song about unlikely encounters, second chances, and rebuilt bridges. Claudia Porter and her social circle commented maliciously on Richard Morgan's fall, on how the powerful businessman had lowered himself by marrying a simple caregiver without a university degree. Tabloid media even insinuated that Irene was a gold digger who had planned everything from the start. Richard ignored it all. His fortune now funded not only the New Perspectives Institute in Chicago, but a growing network of similar centers in other cities. His influence was directed toward pushing for more inclusive public policies. His business empire, still thriving under Gregory's leadership, now prioritized inclusive practices and social responsibility. But his true wealth lay elsewhere, in Luke's increasingly frequent smiles, in Irene's quiet wisdom, in Gabriella's flourishing talent, in the imperfect and extraordinary family they had built together, made not of blood or social conventions, but of daily choices to stay, to love, to grow through hardship. One quiet evening, as they watched Luke sleeping peacefully, a luxury they didn't always have, given the boy's occasional sleep difficulties, Irene intertwined her fingers with Richard's. "You know what I think sometimes," she whispered, "that Helen brought us together, that somehow she guided all of this." Richard felt his eyes well up. It was the first time Irene had mentioned Helen in that way, not as a shadow between them, but as a benevolent presence that had, somehow, blessed their unlikely union. "I think you're right," he replied, after a moment of reflection. "She was always better than me at seeing people's hearts. Maybe she saw yours, long before I did." As they gently closed the door to Luke's room, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 2 years. From a controlled, obsessed businessman to a present father. From a widower consumed by grief to a man capable of loving again. From someone trying to fix his son to someone who had learned to celebrate his uniqueness. In the end, his greatest discovery was surprisingly simple. True love never comes from perfection, but from the persistence to stay, even in the face of flaws, and that sometimes it is in the imperfection of our encounters that the most authentic form of love blossoms, the one that does not impose, does not demand, but simply chooses to stay. End of story, dear listeners. We hope the journey of Richard, Irene, Gabriella, and Luke has deeply touched your hearts. To experience more stories that explore the beauty and differences and the transformative power of genuine love, be sure to visit our special playlist Entwined Souls. Just click here on the side. If this narrative stirred emotions in you, show your appreciation by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. We share stories daily that remind us that true human connection is born not from perfection, but from acceptance. Tell us in the comments which moment of this story touched your heart the most. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you.